When I was 2, my parents got divorced. I don't really remember my dad very much because within a couple months of the divorce, he just kind of left, and I never met him. And growing up initially, because I hadn't ever met him, I didn't realize that you're supposed to have 2 parents in your household. And so I never really felt abandoned by him until 3rd or 4th grade, when I started realizing, talking to my peers and my friends, that you're supposed to have 2 parents in your house, and I didn't. And I had never met my dad. Well, not that I could remember. I didn't know what he looked like, didn't know why he had left me. And that was one of the first times that I really started to understand what it meant to feel abandoned, especially by someone who is supposed to be there.
I distinctly remember a time in my life when I felt abandoned by God. I had been raised in a very close Christian home that included not just going to church on Sundays, but your beliefs, your faith was a 24/7 type of thing. When I was 19, my father died very tragically and very unexpectedly. My mother imploded and turned her back on me, and my brother became a roaring alcoholic and was doing everything he could do to destroy the family. Needless to say, my world imploded. Not only had my father died, but I felt that everything that had ever grounded me, my family and my faith, had died as well. And I felt that if everything I ever had believed in was a phony, was a fake, that Jesus must be a phony and a fake as well.
When I was in 8th grade, my mom was diagnosed with stage 3 uterine cancer, which is very difficult to explain to a 13-year-old. The fact that they told her she had a 5% chance of living 15 years, And I'm 13 at the time. I'm thinking I will be 28 then. I may not be married, I may not have children, I will have no parents at my wedding. These are the thoughts that are going through my mind. And just feeling this crushing loss and the sense of hopelessness.
I never totally quit going to church, but when I did go to church, I would ball my fists up really tightly and I would get really angry because I couldn't believe I was actually in the place of something that I knew wasn't true. And as time went by and continued, I was sitting in church one morning with my fists very tightly bound together, and there was no one around me at the time. Church hadn't started, and I heard just as clearly as I can hear myself speaking today, God saying to me, the only real truth in life is myself, Jesus Christ. And every other truth has a little t. And humans are imperfect and they're going to hurt you. But through this whole thing, I have loved you and I have never abandoned you. And now I want you to go and love my people.
That was the first time that I really came to rely on God, because you grew up in a Christian household, as I did, and I love God. I went to Sunday school, I went to church, I had Christian friends, and my mom did a great job of raising me, to love Christ. But until you realize that there is no one to turn to, even my mother, the person I had depended on and looked up to, that she couldn't save herself. Until I realized that there was no one but God, I didn't fully rely on Him.
From that moment, sitting in that pew when I heard God calling to me to love His people, my life changed. Needless to say, the first thing that happened is my fists unclenched, my heart softened and melted. And ever since then, I've had such a close and growing relationship with Him and trying to live into the call that He gave me to love His people, because that's really what He's about and what I want to be about. And I hope that if you've ever experienced a time that you felt like you were abandoned by God, know that He is there for you and He loves you and He created you, and He could never ever abandon someone that He created in His image.
So happy to say now my mom is still alive. This is, 7 years out of treatment, I think. And she's doing really, really well. They haven't had any signs of recurrence, and she is as lively and enthusiastic and loving as she was before she was diagnosed. But going through cancer, and for her and seeing her go through cancer for me, has changed both of us. And I think it has changed us for the better. As difficult as it was, just realizing, seeing her faith was such an inspiration, seeing her lean on God, even in the face of like unimaginable pain and doubt and fear. Seeing her rely so fully on the Lord was really an inspiration for me. So how about you? Your struggles might not be the same as mine, but it is very possible that you are feeling abandoned by God, or that you have in the past. I think it's very normal to struggle with these things because we all have different pains in our lives. And I just want you to know that no matter what you are struggling with, God is faithful and He is loving, and He's saving. You know, He died on the cross so that you don't have to feel abandoned, so that you can have the hope of something bigger.
One of the hardest questions that I ever get asked as a pastor has to do with the problem of evil. And on one level, it's an intellectual problem. We can say several true propositions. We know that God is real. We know that He's good. We know that He loves us. And yet, at the same time, why are we struggling through evil? And philosophers have debated over that question for not just centuries, but millennia. It is a tough intellectual question to solve. But whenever anybody asks me that question, I know that there's probably something very deeply personal behind it. That they've gone through some pain or are currently going through some difficulty in life. Last week, we talked about distress, where Jesus, from the cross, cried out, "I thirst." There are actually three forms of anguish that we go through in our lives. The first form of anguish is physical suffering. We go through the pains of being in a fallen world as fallen human beings. Our bodies get sick, they break down. We have financial problems. Bad things happen to good people, and so we can have physical anguish. Sometimes those physical anguish are caused by things that we have personally done, and sometimes they just happen to us. But we also have personal anguish, and this is actually tougher. There's a little children's rhyme, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." It's just simply not true. The personal anguish that we experience when people that we love betray us and hurt our feelings, do things that are abusive to us, people actually can be downright cruel. Those wounds are much deeper than any physical wounds. But those first two, physical anguish and personal anguish, lead actually to a third anguish, and that is spiritual anguish. When we experience suffering and we go through hard times, a lot of times when we're going through physical anguish or personal anguish, we end up asking that question that is related to spiritual anguish. God, why are you allowing these people to do these things to me? God, why have you allowed my body to get cancer or to go through this financial crisis in my life? I didn't do anything to deserve this. I don't know why this is happening to me. And we begin to question and ask God, why? Jesus was like us in every way. The gospel passage I want to put before us today is the fifth of the 7 last words of Jesus. Now, from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of the bystanders hearing it thought, this man is calling out to Elijah. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus, the Son of God, true God from true God, in a moment of pain and anguish, felt abandonment from God. One of the writers that I think is very helpful in this subject is a Spanish mystic named St. John of the Cross. In his book, The Dark Night of the Soul, St. John of the Cross talks about 2 dark nights. The first dark night is what we have already described as physical anguish and personal anguish. But it's that first dark night that so often leads to the second dark night of the soul. And that is the dark night of feeling abandoned by God. It's interesting that when Jesus cries out this particular question from the cross, that darkness is covering the entire land in that moment. This, out of all the words from Jesus on the cross, this is the darkest moment. And I know that sometimes we go through very, very dark times in our life. And perhaps you may be in one right now. Maybe you've been one in your past. Inevitably, all of us will have dark nights of the soul, crises that lead to spiritual crises, places where we ask the question, God, why have you allowed this to happen to me? Jesus was actually praying the opening sentence of Psalm 22. Perhaps he had recited the whole psalm in that moment. He knew the scriptures by heart, evidently. But regardless of whether he prayed the whole psalm, what it teaches us is that Jesus prayed honest prayers. If that's the way that he felt in that moment, then surely we can have moments where we get very honest and frank with God. God, why are you allowing this to happen to me? You've been faithful to me before. You've been faithful to your people before, but why are you allowing this to happen? Bands of evildoers have surrounded me. They've pierced my hands and my feet. They gloat. They divide my garments. Psalm 22 is a lament psalm. It's an angry psalm. It's a psalm that is questioning the very nature of the relationship between the psalmist and God. Jesus chose that psalm to express his heart's cry in that moment. You know, when people pray in that kind of way and they begin to express their doubts and honest concerns about their relationship with God, frankly, it makes people feel uncomfortable. That's why a lot of times the response that we often have to somebody going through suffering is one of platitudes. A lot of times I know that I feel this way, and I'm sure you do too sometimes, when somebody's going through a hard time or they just got some horrible news, one of their loved ones has died, or they've been diagnosed with a chronic disease, or something horrible has happened. A lot of times you just don't know what to say. And so what comes out of your mouth is actually not very helpful. We call these platitudes. And basically what a platitude does is it makes the person who's saying it feel better, but it doesn't do anything for the person that's hearing it. A platitude might be, well, it'll all work out in the end, or I'm sure God's going to do something out of this and work all things for good. Sometimes a platitude may be a true statement. It's just said at the really wrong time and in an inappropriate way. Another thing that happens when people go through suffering is sometimes we get a bad attitude. And we start to think that, well, maybe they're deserving this in some way. This is what happened with Job. You'll remember Job's wife, as he lost his health and was suffering, lost his children, that in her anger, she looked at Job as somebody who just needed to curse God and die. And he was surrounded by counselors who said, Job, probably that this is something that you did wrong, and you're just experiencing this suffering because you deserve it. Sometimes that's simply just not the truth. Sometimes we go through suffering because we live in a fallen world, because we are surrounded by evil, and we're just suffering, and it doesn't make any sense. We don't know the reason why. And so what is our response to suffering? How should we think about it? Well, it's interesting that one response is to get angry about it and to try to get vindication. Job goes through a time and a season in his ranting where he wants somebody to plead his case before God because he's getting a bum rap from the Lord. The bystanders who heard Jesus utter, Eli, Eli, thought that he was crying out to the vindicator of the righteous, Elijah, who is the one in the prophets who would come and destroy the enemies of the righteous of God. But Jesus models for us another way. It's the pathway of lament. When I was a chaplain at St. Francis Hospital in Evansville, Illinois, I was a young seminarian. I was just learning how to be a pastoral counselor. And I got a call in the middle of the night of a woman that was suicidal. And she came into the hospital ER and asked for help. The doctors deal with physical wounds, but they don't know what to do with spiritual and emotional wounds. So they called the chaplain. And so I walked into this room, and here's a woman sitting in a chair, and her head was down, and her eyes were shut. And I introduced myself. I said, I'm the pastor of the hospital. And she said, Chaplain, I'm depressed. Now, I was a very new priest at the time. I was a rookie. And so all I knew to do was reflective listening. You feel depressed, is what I said. And then she said, yes, I feel depressed because. And her life was falling apart, her marriage was a mess, she was going through financial problems, and all of these physical and personal problems were leading to a spiritual crisis for her. And all I did was just reflect back her emotion and what she was saying, emotion and content. That's reflective listening. You know, that actually, as simple as that was the best thing that I could have done. As I sat there and just listened to her and let her vent and let her rant and let her be angry at God, her head came up and her eyes opened. Her pastor called the hospital and got on the phone with her. And as she got on the phone with her pastor, all he had was platitudes. He said to her, hey, you have the victory. You're not depressed. You've got the joy of the Lord. And he started giving her all these positive things. I watched her as she was talking on the phone with her pastor. Her head started bending down. Her eyes got shut again. And she went right back into despair. You know, one of the most important things that we can do for one another as members of the family of God and the body of Christ is to just draw alongside of each other when we're going through hard times and be empathetic in the midst of the crisis. To listen to the ranting, to listen to the honest prayers. I try to take what people are saying and lift those prayers as honestly as I can to God. If somebody says they're angry at God, that becomes the frame of my prayer. God, we're angry right now because we're going through this time. Lord, we are sad. We don't understand why. I have prayed more why prayers in my pastorate than I have any other kinds of prayers, because those are the kinds of prayers that actually lead to healing for people going through the dark night of the soul. You know what? Jesus is able to sympathize and empathize with you in your weakness. The promise from Scripture is that He has become like us in any way. And as Jesus was dying on the cross and going through the physical and the spiritual dark night of the soul, He was joining with you and entering into your pain. My God, why have you forsaken me?" are the words of the great high priest who gave his life up for us all, that we might one day be liberated from this sinful and broken world and receive the joy and the fullness of abundance of life that comes from being children of God and dearly loved by Him.